They say the average person has about 60,000 thoughts a day. Most are mundane. What should I have for lunch? Did I lock the front door? But what happens when some of those thoughts are monstrous? Edmund Kemper, a man who stood 6'9" and had an IQ of 145, put it plainly. He said, "When I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think two things. One part of me wants to take her out, talk to her, be real nice and sweet and treat her right. The other part of me thinks, I wonder what her head would look like on a stick." That's not a monster from a storybook. That was a man who lived and breathed among us. And the job of figuring out why that second thought wins, that falls to a very specific type of investigator. For decades, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has been tasked with crawling inside minds like Kemper's to understand the mechanics of evil, not to excuse it, but to predict it, to track it, and to stop it. The central question isn't just about catching a criminal, it's about deconstructing a psyche, so warped it operates on a logic entirely its own. How do you map a mind that's a labyrinth of rage, fantasy, and control? The foundation of this entire process, the first chapter in the profiler's playbook, is understanding the crime scene as a psychological fingerprint. It's the difference between an organized and a disorganized offender. This isn't just academic jargon. It's the most critical fork in the road at the start of an investigation. The organized killer thinks Ted Bundy is meticulous. The crime scene is controlled. He brings his own weapons, his own restraints. He cleans up after himself. He disposes of the body far from the abduction site. This isn't just a murder, it's a project. Psychologically, this tells us we're looking for someone intelligent, socially competent. He might have a family, a steady job. He follows the case in the news. He's playing a game with us. The disorganized killer, on the other hand, leaves chaos in his wake. The attack is sudden, a blitz. He uses a weapon of opportunity, a lamp from the bedside table, a kitchen knife. The scene is a mess. This tells a different story. We're likely looking for someone with poor social skills, someone who lives alone, possibly with a history of mental illness. He's not playing a game, he's exploding. He acts on a compulsion he can't control. Let me tell you about a case we'll call the perp the Postman. We had a series of break-ins that escalated to murder. The first few scenes were messy, frantic. We were leaning disorganized, some local kid, probably on drugs, panicking. But something felt off. Certain details were too chaotic, almost staged. In the third house, he'd overturned a bookshelf, but the books had fallen in neat piles. A profiler from Quantico took one look and said, "He wants us to think he's stupid. He's organized, and he's enjoying this." That single insight changed everything. We stopped looking for low-life junkies and started looking for someone smart, someone hiding in plain sight. Turns out the Postman was a university librarian. He was trying to lay a false trail by mimicking the disorganized profile. Have you ever noticed how people try to manage the impression you have of them, even in small ways? Maybe a colleague who acts overwhelmed and incompetent so they aren't given more work. It's the same principle, just taken to a lethal extreme. The core psychological principle here is what's called cognitive scripting. The organized killer has a detailed script in his head, a fantasy he's rehearsing and perfecting with each victim. The disorganized killer has no script, he's just raw, violent impulse. Recognizing which performance you're watching is the first step to finding the actor. Now, how do we use that? We move from the what to the who using two types of reasoning, inductive and deductive. Inductive profiling is statistical. We look at data from hundreds of solved cases and say, a killer who does X, Y, and Z is likely a white male in his 30s with a history of animal abuse. It gives you a place to start. But deductive profiling is where the art comes in. It's building a profile from the physical evidence of a single crime scene. No statistics, just the torn curtain, the type of knots used, the specific words scrawled on the wall. It's the difference between saying most arsonists are and saying this arsonist is. It's a subtle but crucial shift, and it's where experience trumps a textbook every time. Let's talk about Theodore Robert Bundy. To the world, he was handsome, charismatic, a law student with a bright political future. He was the poster boy for the organized killer. His crimes were meticulously planned, his victims chosen with a predator's precision. He was a chameleon. using a fake cast or crutches to feign vulnerability and lure his victims into a position of trust. This is the ultimate expression of the psychopath's mask of sanity. It's not that he doesn't know right from wrong in the way you and I do, it's that those concepts are completely irrelevant to him. They are rules for other people. The early investigation into the disappearances across Washington and Utah was stymied because law enforcement was looking for a monster, a social outcast lurking in the shadows. They weren't looking for a charming, well-dressed man driving a Volkswagen Beetle. They were operating on an inductive model that didn't account for a predator of his sophistication. Bundy's case fundamentally changed the FBI's approach because it proved that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who look just like us. The breakthrough came when profilers started to look past the act of the crime and into the psychology of the performance. Bundy wasn't just killing, he was fulfilling a deep-seated narcissistic fantasy. He needed to possess his victims, to exert absolute control. The fact that he returned to the bodies, that he kept souvenirs, these weren't random ghoulish acts. They were behavioral tells. They spoke to a profound insecurity and an insatiable ego. An interrogator I knew, a man named Henderson, used to say, every interrogation is a seduction. You have to find what the suspect loves more than his freedom and use it. For Bundy, what he loved was his own perceived brilliance. He believed he was smarter than everyone in the room. When investigators finally cornered him, they didn't get a confession by hammering him with evidence. They got it by stroking his ego. They presented the case as a complex puzzle that only a genius could have pulled off. They essentially challenged him to take credit for his masterpiece, and his narcissism wouldn't let him resist. He started talking in the third person, hypothesizing about what the killer might have done, slowly but surely painting a perfect self-portrait. I once worked a fraud case involving a man, let's call him Vincent, who bilked a dozen wealthy widows out of their life savings. He wasn't a killer, but the psychological architecture was identical to Bundy's. He was handsome, silver-tongued, and radiated an aura of success and empathy. He didn't break down doors he was invited in. When we finally had him in the box, he was cool as ice. He denied everything. For hours, nothing. Then, my partner changed tactics. He stopped asking about the money. Instead, he said, "Vincent, I've got to hand it to you. The way you got Eleanor P., a woman who wouldn't give a dime to her own son, to sign over her entire estate, that's artistry. I've never seen anything like it." Vincent's posture changed. A small smirk appeared. He leaned forward. "She wasn't the hardest," he said. "And the dam broke. He just had to let us know how smart he was. Have you ever dealt with someone so arrogant they ended up undermining themselves? Maybe at work or in a family dispute. That need for validation is a powerful lever. The psychological underpinning is narcissistic personality disorder. These individuals have a grandiose sense of self-importance, a need for excessive admiration, and a complete lack of empathy. Their entire world is a stage, and they are the star. The profiler's job is to become the audience they crave, to applaud so loudly that they forget they're supposed to be hiding. If Ted Bundy was the smooth, charismatic predator who hid in plain sight, Dennis Rader the BTK killer was the nerdy, meticulous sadist who craved the spotlight. For 30 years, he terrorized Wichita, Kansas, living a double life as a church council president and a city compliance officer. His moniker, which he gave himself, stood for bind, torture, kill. That wasn't just a description of his methods, it was his brand. BTK represents a different, but equally potent, psychological driver for serial offenders, the desperate need for recognition. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted credit for his work. This is a common thread you find in a certain type of offender. The act itself isn't enough to satisfy the fantasy must be validated by the outside world. He needed to be seen as a criminal mastermind, an elusive phantom who held an entire city in his grip. So he communicated. He sent letters to the media and the police, taunting them, reveling in their inability to catch him. This is what we call behavioral leakage. No matter how careful a criminal is, a part of his true self always leaks out. In BTK's letters, the FBI's behavioral analysis unit didn't just see taunts, they saw a personality profile. They saw a man who was incredibly patient, detail-oriented, and arrogant. They saw someone with a procedural job, someone comfortable with rules and regulations, which he was. As a compliance officer, he wrote like he was filing a report. His obsession with media coverage and his long silences followed by bursts of activity suggested someone who was biding his time, living out his fantasies in his head until the pressure became too much. The profilers predicted he couldn't stay silent forever. His ego wouldn't let him. They knew that if they gave him an opening, he would take it. And in 2004, after a decade of silence, he did. He started communicating again, asking a question that would be his downfall. Could a floppy disk be traced? The police, in a stroke of genius, placed an ad in the paper and said, "Rex, it will be okay." They told him no, it couldn't. It was a lie. He sent them the disk. On it, metadata from a document last modified by a user named Dennis at the Christ Lutheran Church. His ego wrote a check his tradecraft couldn't cash. I remember a series of arsons in a small industrial town back in the 80s. The fires were expertly set, causing maximum damage but no casualties. The fire marshal was stumped. Then letters started arriving at the local paper, signed by the Phoenix. The letters were full of technical details about accelerants and combustion, bragging about how the fire department was always one step behind. My partner read them and said, "This isn't a professional criminal. This is a frustrated firefighter." He was right. The arsonist was a guy who had been rejected by the local fire academy 3 times. He wasn't burning buildings for money or revenge. He was burning them to prove he was better than the people who had rejected him. He was leaking his own story in every letter he wrote. We simply started re-interviewing all the academy washouts. Have you ever been so proud of something you did that you just had to tell someone, even if it was supposed to be a secret? That impulse, that desire for your efforts to be acknowledged, is a fundamental part of the human psyche. For killers like BTK, it's a fatal flaw. This stems from a psychological concept known as the Herostratic Fame Complex, named after Herostratus, who burned down the Temple of Artemis just to have his name recorded in history. These individuals crave infamy as a substitute for genuine achievement. They'd rather be known for something terrible than not be known at all. The profiler's job is to set a stage big enough for that ego to walk right onto it. To catch a monster, you have to understand how it thinks. But how do you do that without becoming one yourself? This is the central challenge that faced men like John Douglas, one of the pioneers of modern criminal profiling. In the late 1970s, he and his partner Robert Ressler did something revolutionary, and too many of their colleagues, something insane. They went into the country's most secure prisons and sat down, face to face, with its most violent serial killers. They interviewed Ed Kemper, Charles Manson, Richard Specca, who's who of human nightmares. They weren't there to gloat or to condemn. They were there to listen. Their goal was to build a psychological database from the source, to understand the motivations, the fantasies, the childhood traumas, the entire life trajectory that culminates in murder. Douglas understood that to build a profile of a killer you haven't caught, you first have to understand the ones you have. This was the birth of the systematic study of the criminal mind. The techniques Douglas developed were a masterclass in psychological manipulation, but not in the way you might think. It wasn't about high-pressure tactics, it was about creating a non-judgmental space. He would often open an interview by empathizing with the killer's perspective, not condoning the actions, but acknowledging the killer's internal logic. With a manipulator like Manson, he knew a direct confrontation would be useless. Instead, he allowed Manson to believe he was in control of the interview, letting him ramble and posture, all the while gathering data from his word choices, his body language, his obsessions. The key was to understand what we call the primary motive. Is it power, control, sexual sadism? For Kemper, it was a deep-seated rage against his domineering mother, which he then projected onto his victims. For others, it's an addiction to the godlike power of deciding who lives and who dies. Once you identify that core driver, the rest of the killer's behavior begins to make a terrifying kind of sense. This work, however, comes at a tremendous cost. I knew a detective, a good man named Frank, who was a natural at interrogation. He had an uncanny ability to build rapport with the worst of the worst. He worked a particularly horrific case involving a predator who targeted children. For months, Frank immersed himself in the case files, the crime scene photos, the suspect's history. He spent over 40 hours in the interrogation room with the man. He got the confession and the locations of 2 other victims. He was a hero, but he was never the same. He became distant, paranoid. He started seeing threats everywhere. He told me once, "I spent so much time looking into the abyss. I think a piece of it looked back into me." He took early retirement a year later. What do you think is the line between empathy as a tool and letting the darkness you're studying seep into you? It's a question every good cop, every profiler, has to ask themselves. The psychological term for this is vicarious traumatization. It's the emotional residue of exposure to the traumatic experiences of others. Douglas himself nearly died from the stress of his work. It's a stark reminder that this isn't an academic exercise. Profiling is a journey into the darkest parts of the human condition, and you don't take that journey without paying a toll at the gate. To do the job, you have to find a way to touch that darkness without letting it stain you permanently. It's the hardest part of the job, and not everyone can do it. We've come a long way from the days of John Douglas sitting in a prison cell with a tape recorder. Today's behavioral analysis unit has tools at its disposal that would have seemed like science fiction 40 years ago. They use vast databases like VicApp to find connections between cases across the country. They employ geographic profiling, using complex algorithms to analyze the spatial patterns of crimes and predict where an offender most likely lives or works. What we call their anchor point. Artificial intelligence can now sift through terabytes of data, social media posts, financial records, online histories to find behavioral red flags that a human analyst might miss. It's a powerful new arsenal, but we have to be careful. The danger in all this technology is the temptation to see crime as just a data problem. We risk losing the human element. An algorithm can tell you where a killer might be, but it can't sit across a table from him and understand why he does what he does. The future of profiling isn't just about catching killers after the fact, it's about prevention. Can we use our understanding of behavioral escalation patterns to spot potential killers before they act? We know there are common precursors: a history of animal cruelty, arson, a progression from fantasy to stalking. The ethical question is, what do we do with that information? It's a fine line between threat assessment and thought policing. I knew a kid in my old neighborhood, quiet boy, always getting picked on, started torturing squirrels, then cats. Everyone just called him creepy. A few years later, he nearly beat another teenager to death over a minor insult. The signs were all there, but nobody connected the dots. The real challenge for the next generation of profilers won't just be technology. It will be integrating these tools with old-fashioned community policing and mental health outreach. Do you believe that with enough data, we could one day predict and prevent violent crime before it happens? Or is there a dark corner of human nature that will always remain unpredictable? The core lesson from all of this, from the organized Bundy to the egotistical BTK, from the intuitive mind of John Douglas to the analytical power of AI, is this: profiling is not a magic trick. It's not the clairvoyant gift you see on television. It is a grueling, methodical process. It's one part science, statistics, data, psychology. It's one part art, intuition, experience, and the ability to find a signal in the noise of human depravity. It's about recognizing that every crime scene is a story, every action is a confession, and every killer, no matter how clever they think they are, is leaking their own secrets. They are writing their own biography, one victim at a time. The profiler's job is simply to be a very careful reader. It's about walking into the heart of a storm and, with a steady hand, drawing a map.